come now to the main business and to the motion relating to the badger cull. I have selected the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister. To move the motion, I call the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Mary Cray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the motion standing in my name and those of my right honourable friends. Mr. Speaker, we begin with a question. Is culling badgers the most effective way to stop the spread of bovine TB? We on this side of the House believe that it is not. And the consensus of scientists who are not on the government payroll is also that it is not. They call it a costly distraction and a crazy scheme. They urge the government to change its course. We on this side will be led by those scientists, as we were both in government and now in opposition. This is a cull based on hope, not on science. And we've warned the government for 2 years that this cull will be bad for farmers, bad for taxpayers and bad for wildlife. In government, we were open to the idea. We asked the question, will culling work? And we conducted a 10-year-long, £50 million randomised badger control trial. That trial concluded it will not work. And if it will not work, then the alternatives, however difficult, must be explored. I want to begin by explaining why this cull is bad for farmers affected by bovine TB, the biggest animal disease challenge this country faces. It is bad for farmers as the cull would cost them more than it saves them. Bad for farmers because the science does not stack up. And bad for farmers as tourists decide to holiday somewhere else, having decided that the sound of gunfire and protest is not conducive to vacation relaxation. I know the toll that this terrible disease takes on farmers and their families, personally, emotionally and financially. I'll make some progress and then I'll give way. Controlling it is imperative to protect farmers' livelihoods. The European Union requires us to have a national strategy for eradication. Badgers carry TB. They transmit it to cattle, but the infection also passes from cattle to cattle, cattle to badgers, and between badgers. We know this because during the 2001 foot and mouth epidemic, when no testing was carried out on cattle, TB in badgers increased by 70%. The independent scientific group and 4 scientists from the Animal Health and Veterinary Laboratories Agency say this was due to a substantial transmission of TB from cattle to badgers. Now, the routes of infection and transmission of this disease are still poorly understood. This cull is bad for farmers because of the large costs and the small benefits. I give way.
The Honourable Lady has now repeated twice that this cull is bad for farmers. If that is the case, why have they gone to such considerable trouble, expense and risk of adverse publicity in actually carrying out these culls?
I understand the desperation that farmers are under, but I think the government has presented culling as the silver bullet, and it is not. If it's presented as the thing that will stop this disease, it will not. And I will come on to why it presents further risks further in my speech. Because it's not just this cull, it's about what happens if the cull stops. I give way.
Grateful to the Honourable Lady giving way. In an ideal world, I hope the whole House would agree that we want healthy badgers, a healthy countryside and healthy cattle. And the Honourable Lady and I have got on very well over many years on animal welfare issues, but I have to say there is a sense of political opportunism in the Labour Party's position. And is it not the case that the last government had done more on investing in trying to find a vaccination, that the difficult decisions having to be made in this House today, and more importantly by those outside this House, would not have to have been taken? So vaccination should have been the route, but it should have been undertaken years ago.
I don't know whether the Honourable Member for the Wrekin is hoping to catch the eye of the Chair later in the debate to make his speech, or whether he feels he's just delivered it. Mary Cray.
Well, in government we spent £20 million on delivering a vaccine, and that contrasts rather unhappily with this government's investment. Investment in 2009-10 in a cattle vaccine under Labour was 3,698,000, and on a badger vaccine was 3,698,000. Badger vaccine 3,200,000. That will fall by 2014-15 to 2 million on a cattle vaccine and 1.6 million on a badger vaccine. So I don't think I'm going to take any lessons from him about the investment needed in vaccine. When we spent the money, we've delivered the badger vaccine. His government has cancelled 5 of our 6 badger vaccine trials. If they had not been cancelled, we would now be a lot further down the road of understanding how that badger vaccine works in the field. I want to make some progress. The cull method, free shooting, is untested. The number of badgers removed may be lower than in Labour's RBCT.
It is untested.
Nobody shot a badger, Mr. Speaker, in the UK legally since 1973. So it's an untested method. If that happens, it risks making TB worse. I've said I'll make some progress and then I'll give way to him. We don't know how much this cull is actually costing the farmers involved, so we rely on the government's own cost-benefit analysis. Culling makes TB worse by spreading the disease in the first 2 years. The benefits only appear after year 3 across the whole culling area, but in the ring area, the edge of where the cull is carried out, there are never any benefits. Do the farmers whose land lies alongside the cull zones realise this? I think not. Labour's cull showed that culling badgers is estimated to reduce the incidence of TB in cattle by 16% after 9 years. 84% of the problem is still there. 16% is the best case scenario based on the TB rate being twice as high in the cull area as the land outside. But if background TB rates are constant across the whole area, that benefit reduces to just 12%. And this is not an absolute reduction. It is a 16% reduction from the trend increase.
Absolutely.
So after 9 years, there is still more TB around than there was at the beginning. There is 16% less than there would have been without a cull. And I want to look at how that 16% reduction is achieved. The cull depends on killing at least 70% of badgers in the cull area. Yet last year, the Secretary of State was about to start the culls without knowing how many badgers needed to be shot.
Remarkable.
His officials only started counting the badgers in September, just weeks before the cull was due to start. They relied on farmers to count the sets, and that did not work. I give way.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady. I will remind her that in the last Parliament, as a result of the destruction that this disease is causing in Shropshire, I set up the all-party group for dairy farmers, and it became one of the largest all-party groups with over 250 MPs. Over 70 MPs joined that all-party group, and we all worked very constructively on the report which was published, which stated the need for a cull. It will be very interesting to see how many of those Labour MPs changed their minds this evening. But there was a consensus at that time from many Labour MPs that a cull was the only viable option.
Well, I haven't read that report, but I can see from the EFRA Select Committee report today that there is a report on badger vaccine, on badger control. Culling is not mentioned in that report. So the Select Committee, the EFRA Select Committee is, well, it's extraordinary that a report on bovine TB doesn't mention the government's I know it's on vaccines, but it's extraordinary that it doesn't mention the government's main control strategy, the main innovation on that. And I want to go back to these badger numbers. Last year, the estimates from the farm industry were in West Gloucestershire that 1,800 badgers needed to be shot. No, there were 1,800 badgers. In West Somerset, there were 2,700. The government's figures then rose to an estimate between 3,000 and 4,000 in West Gloucestershire, 3,000 and 5,000 in West Somerset, which is why the culls stopped. This year, we have a different set of figures, 2,500 to 4,000 in West Gloucestershire, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 in West Somerset. Now, there's a problem with this, because if we're dealing with ranges of figures, we are licensing people to kill 70% of the badgers. If the badger numbers are at the lower end of the range, the marksmen that have been licensed could kill 100% of the badger population and still not meet their licensing criteria. I think that's a really difficult position to put the farmers in. I give way.
isn't it the case that free shooting's been adopted because it's simply the cheapest way to kill? If you're committed to a culling strategy, there are alternatives that could be more effective, but free shooting is cheap, and that's what we're getting, killing on the cheap.
Well, that's right. I mean, the cull, the free shooting method has been adopted because cage trapping and shooting is much more expensive, 10 times more expensive. And, of course, there is a risk to the taxpayer. If anything goes wrong in these cull areas, there is a bond that has been laid. We don't know how much that bond is. We don't know how much the estimate is. But if anything, if the government has to step in and conclude these culls, we are completely in the dark about the risk to the taxpayer of completing those culls. So, I will give way.
Can my honourable friend comment on the impact of partial genocide of badgers in England, whilst there's vaccination in Wales, and whether English badgers will be running across the border to seek refuge in Wales?
I commend the approach of the Welsh Assembly Government, and I'm glad to see that preliminary results from that are looking very positive. I just want to come back to this issue about the 16% reduction and the 12% reduction. It depends. The cull depends on killing 70% of badgers in the cull area. I asked the question about badger numbers back in July 2011. I received the answer: there is no precise knowledge of the size of the badger population. So that was a year before the culls were stopped last year. Why did ministers not ask that same question? And can they tell us, perhaps in their speech, how confident are they of those numbers now, given the risks to localised extinction in the cull areas? They state that the reductions in TB will result from following the RBCT method, yet that method was totally different, using cage trapping and shooting, not free shooting, as my friend for Hall Green has mentioned. The Secretary of State last year used the 28% reduction figure in October when he announced the culls were delayed. This is another example of him cherry-picking the data, and it ignores the perturbation effect. I'm going to explain perturbation, so I'll just get that over with, if you don't mind. This is where badgers are displaced by the shooting and leave their sets, spreading TB to neighbouring areas. Labour's trial culls revealed that culling increases TB in badgers by a factor of 1.9 because of perturbation. That's 90%. Ministers affirm that this cull will have hard boundaries to avoid that perturbation effect, but they ignore the fact that the RBCT had hard boundaries where possible as well. I give way.
The honourable lady has skated over the reasons why farmers, contrary to her assertion, are in fact very strongly in support of this policy. And the reason is this, that the number of reactors has increased in 10 years by a factor of 8, and is driving farmers in my constituency near to suicide in some cases. Does the lady not understand these central, crucial human issues?
I understand the human issues very well, but I would say that the farming community is also divided on this issue. I have a letter from cattle farmers opposed to the badger cull from Gloucestershire. They've given me permission to read. Well, that one, says the minister. Oh, well, I don't know if there's just one. I'm assuming there's more than one. But they say that the consultation events held by DEFRA's Animal Health and Welfare Board and the published reports from these events show no consensus for a badger cull, and that farmers are concerned about the indiscriminate shooting of large numbers of badgers. And I would also say to him that there's a letter in today's Independent criticising the British Veterinary Association's support for the cull as well. So I think it's fair to say that the veterinary community is also divided on that. And that is obviously problematic. It is never good to have a policy that divides the country in such a bitter way. I'm going to make some progress, and then I'll take some interventions. There has been a huge concern from scientists over the lack of rigour in the design, implementation, monitoring and efficacy of these culls. And the proportion of badgers that are infected with bovine TB is not, as the Secretary of State claims, significant. In the RBCT, it was 1 in 9, about 12%. Now, I come on to another significant difference between these pilot culls and Labour's RBCT. Labour's culls, I will.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. Can I apologise to her that I missed the opening, her opening remarks? I wanted to, while she's talking about perturbation, and she's absolutely right, it is a key issue. But she is not right, I dare to say, that the ISG trials were based on hard boundaries. The fact is, they had to have exact 100 square kilometres, otherwise, obviously, that it wouldn't be comparable. And therefore they largely had to accept boundaries as they were. The difference here is that by not having a maximum size, they can choose the zone to meet whatever good hard boundaries they can find. So we actually made steps to minimise the perturbation that would occur, and therefore the net benefit should be much higher than achieved in the ISG trial.
Order. Can I just point out that there are more than 20 honourable and right honourable members seeking to contribute in the debate, and therefore some self-discipline in the length of interventions would be greatly appreciated from all members, including Knights of the Realm. Mary Cray.
I give way to my honourable friend.
My right honourable friend knows that I am a great campaigner for the countryside. But can I just make the point, following the point made from the other benches, that there are many people in this country, as well as farmers, who love our countryside, care about farm stock, but care about the countryside and the animals that have lived in it for thousands of years. And the fact is that there isn't the evidence for this cull, and that's what they resent. Yeah. I was chair of a select committee. The watchword was, if you can possibly do it, build policies on the evidence. This isn't a policy based on any evidence.
Yeah. Well, I thank my honourable friend for that reply. I'll come back to the perturbation side of things, because my understanding from the scientists who conducted the cull is that hard boundaries were used where it was possible. And we all know as well that badgers can swim rivers and they can cross roads. We know that the biggest impact on the badger population is them getting run over on roads. So again, the efficacy of these hard boundaries has yet to be proven. Our culls, Labour's culls, took place over 8 to 12 days. These culls take place over 6 weeks. This matters because when Labour's culls took place over more than 12 days, the level of TB in badgers increased by a factor of 1.7, showing that slow culls, which is what the government is licensing, increases TB in badgers. If the methodology change, then so do the predicted results. So these culls risk making TB worse. Slow culling makes TB worse in badgers, and perturbation makes TB worse in cattle on neighbouring farms. Now, the government says the cull will work, and they have downplayed the risks of making things worse. And I think they've downplayed the risks to neighbouring farmers. If the culls are marred by protests, culling is likely to be driven underground and become more localised, which will make bovine TB in cattle worse. And this goes back to the fact that the honourable gentleman was mentioning. If it's driven underground and it happens on a localised basis, the one thing we know is you drive the badgers away and you increase it in your neighbour's farm. And that is why illegal killing of badgers is so incredibly selfish of farmers, because it is effectively spreading the infection around the neighbourhood. Farmers are frustrated, and I understand that. They believe this cull is the solution, but they also want a science-led solution, and this is not that solution. This is why the badger cull will be bad for farmers. I want to turn now to why the badger cull will be bad for the taxpayer. What have the costs to the taxpayer been so far? Over £300,000 for licensing activities carried out by Natural England. Set monitoring has cost £750,000. An independent expert panel to monitor the cull, £17,000. And surveying the reserve site in Dorset will add to this total. Since April 2012, there have been 6 DEFRA staff working on the cull. This cull has already cost the taxpayer well over £1 million before it's even started. But what are the costs to the taxpayer if the cull proceeds? The estimated cost of humaneness monitoring is £700,000. Badger post-mortems, another £250,000. The policing costs for each cull area are put at £500,000 a year, and there is a strong steer from the police that they will need to send armed police to police any nighttime demonstrations, taking up scarce police resources. Now, I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman of North Wiltshire.
For Dunblade for Green Way, would you not agree with me that the true cost to taxpayers, nothing to do with these small costs he's mentioning, is the 189,500 cows that have been killed unnecessarily, and the up to £1 billion a year is costing the taxpayer to compensate the farmer?
Well, the Secretary of State said at the weekend he wants to roll out a further 10 areas a year over the next 2 years. So he, for one, has already made up his mind on the efficacy and humaneness of these so-called pilots. And assuming he gets his way, that's £5 million a year for the police alone. I think the police costs are actually material because, I won't give way, the police costs are material because at a time when the police are facing 20% cuts and you're asking armed response vehicles to go out into the countryside, it takes those resources away from cities, which is where there tends to be more gun crime than out in the countryside. I think it's very problematic for police forces in terms of monitoring it. And let's not forget, I spoke with someone from Devon and Cornwall Police, and they said they only had a tiny number of response vehicles to monitor from the end of Cornwall all the way up to Exeter. They're already facing a huge challenge. I'm going to make some progress. If farmers pull out of the cull and the bond does not cover the taxpayers the cost of completing the culls for 4 years, once more the taxpayer will pay. The government talks of the costs of TB, as the Honourable Gentleman has, but in a parliamentary answer to me in September 2011, the then Farms Minister, who is in his place, said the cull would lead to 5 fewer herd breakdowns a year in each cull area. And in 2010, there were more than 2,000 confirmed herd breakdowns in England. So even if the culls are rolled out with 10 cull areas a year, the cull would prevent just 50 herd breakdowns a year. So the taxpayer costs of culling will not be recouped by a reduction in the costs of bovine TB. So this cull will go on being bad for taxpayers until ministers cancel it. I'll give way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the issue of police security, will she unhesitatingly condemn any illegal harassment of farmers who do take part in any cull?
Absolutely. There is no place for illegal activity, and what I think is interesting is that the government is ignoring the advice of the scientists, who are not some animal rights extremists, who actually went out, faced down the animal rights extremists and stood in isolated fields across the country to deliver this cull. The scientists who did that did it in the name and the cause of science, and they have said it won't work. They're not in any way soft about this, but I think that's a point that needs to be re-emphasised. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. There is a further cost. If I understand that the government are rightly insisting that there should be vaccination on land adjoining the culling area, she hasn't mentioned the cost of that, and of course to do that properly, that will have to be rolled out over at least 4 years.
That's right, and vaccination has to take place every year because of the life cycle of the badger, and he's right to raise that. I'm not clear. I know there was a fund made available for vaccination. I don't know how much of that vaccination fund has been actually spent, because I think it was supposed to be match funded by farmers. So perhaps the Minister can enlighten us on that for a moment. I'm going to make some progress and then I will give way. I want to move on now about the effect on badgers. The so-called pilots are supposed simply to test the humaneness, safety and effectiveness of the free shooting of badgers. No information has been made public about how wounded animals that retreat underground to die can be included in the humaneness assessment. We do not know the proportion of badger carcasses that will be collected for post-mortems to see if they were killed quickly. And observers will measure the animals' vocalisations and the time between shooting and death to measure that humaneness. But as we know already, the Secretary of State has already made up his mind that culling is the way forward. So this is a purely academic exercise. I give way.
Thank you for giving way. If, as she suggests, culling is an inhumane approach to badgers, why does she believe that the British Veterinary Association and the British Cattle Veterinary Association are full square behind the government's policy?
Well, I've just mentioned the letter in the Independent today. I don't know if you've seen it. I'm not sure that they're four square behind it, and the government itself doesn't know whether it's humane, and that's why these alleged pilots are allegedly about humaneness. Yes. So his own government's position is they don't know if it's humane. If the government's numbers are wrong, or marksmen kill more badgers than they're licensed for, badgers could be wiped out locally. If they kill too few, under 70%, TB will increase. And I've talked about the badger population numbers and the ranges that there are there. So there could be localised extinction. The police's, in one moment, the police's National Wildlife Crime Unit raised concerns back in 2010, I received this under Freedom of Information, that the publication of maps detailing badger sets could be used for badger persecution, their phrase, not mine, and the misuse of pesticides for poisoning badgers. There has already been one report of alleged pesticide misuse in Gloucestershire, which police are investigating, I understand. So can ministers confirm whether the cull will proceed in Gloucestershire if wildlife crime is found to have been committed? I give way.
It's grateful. Before the Honourable Lady concludes, I'm just very concerned, because I have the highest regard for the Honourable Lady. I think we've worked very well together in Yorkshire on a number of issues, but it appears the argument from the opposition is very negative. I think we would like to know if the badger cull was not to go ahead, what alternatives are there? Because I think our report that we've published today speaks for itself.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that, Right Honourable Lady, for that intervention. I'm going to come on to that in my speech, but I think her report certainly talks about the need for a proper strategy and a coherent policy, and I'm not sure that that is what we've got from this government. In Gloucestershire, the police... I give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable is correctly highlighting an issue that hundreds of my constituents have written to me about, which is animal cruelty, with a lack of evidence and no consensus on this matter. Does my honourable friend think that this is a matter that cannot go ahead in the light of the huge public concern? And it's extraordinary that honourable members opposite have not reflected that concern for their own constituents.
Well, I know there is a great deal of public concern, and any policy has to be socially, environmentally and politically deliverable, and I think the Minister's decision to pursue the cull is certainly going to test the limits of that. In Gloucestershire, the Police and Crime Commissioner is against the cull, and the County Council has said that culling will not take place on their land. There are serious practical difficulties with free shooting near footpaths and campsites with bullets that can travel up to 2 miles. So if it goes ahead, this cull will not end well. So the cull will be bad for farmers, bad for taxpayers and bad for wildlife. I want to come on now. If it is not the most effective way to stop TB, then why is the cull going ahead? No, I won't give way. I'm moving on. There are 20 people who want to speak, so I want to make some progress. There's a very simple answer, because it's a simple solution to a complex problem, because the alternatives, stricter controls on cattle movement, faster TB testing, more TB testing and more restriction on movements, promise yet more hardship and expense to hard-pressed farmers and to the government. Because the government believes that vaccinating badgers, the approach taken by my colleagues in the Welsh Assembly government, is too expensive. But the high cost of policing the expected protests against the shoots means the expense of the cull now exceeds that of vaccination. The UK's top badger expert, Professor Rosie Woodruff, has analysed the numbers. The government's estimates of badger vaccination are £2,250 per square kilometre a year, and the cull is £1,000 per square kilometre per year. So at first sight, the cull is cheaper than vaccinating. But when the government estimates of policing the cull are added at £1,429 per square kilometre per year, vaccination becomes the cheaper option. And what a pity for farmers, I won't give way, that DEFRA ministers cancelled 5 of Labour's 6 badger vaccination trials. Early results from the remaining site near Stroud show a 79% reduction in TB transmission to unvaccinated badger cubs. That means they are almost certainly less infectious to cattle and to other badgers. 2 or 3 years of vaccination would give badgers full immunity as the old badgers die off. I give way.
The Honourable Lady has given us a tremendous amount of statistics in her speech, for which I'm really grateful. Could she tell us how many farmers she's actually consulted with? And could she give us a few statistics about the amount of cattle that we've already seen destroyed?
Touch with farmers all the time, and I had a meeting with the NFU. Well, you know, I've had meetings with them in Derbyshire. I've had meetings across the country. I've met with farmers across the country. 2 or 3 years of vaccination would give badgers full immunity as the old badgers die off. So the wildlife trusts, the RSPB and National Trust are all vaccinating badgers on their land, and the Zoological Society of London and the wildlife trusts are pushing volunteer involvement in badger vaccination, which will greatly reduce the cost. Now, I want to come on to the EFRA Select Committee report, which was published today, and pay tribute to the Right Honourable Honourable Lady and her committee for that. It says the badger vaccine has been available for 3 years, but the government should now produce a clear strategy for using it. I think that's a pretty damning indictment on what this government has been doing for the last 3 years. We also now have a cattle TB vaccine and a DIVA test to distinguish between infected and vaccinated cows as a result of the investment that Labour made in both of those vaccines. The EFRA Select Committee report is critical of the government's approach to cattle vaccination. They say the debate on cattle vaccination is unclear and, I quote, "The government must accept a great deal of the blame for this." They say, and I quote, "The quality and accuracy of the information that DEFRA has put into the public domain has been insufficient and inadequate. The government has delayed doing field trials of the cattle vaccine as they misinterpreted EU rules, but they must undertake field trials now as soon as possible." But I want to be clear, a vaccine for badgers or a vaccine for cattle will by itself not work just on its own. There needs to be a coherent policy framework to tackle all aspects of this complex disease. The ISG suggested several key principles that could form the basis of that policy. They say on page 175 of their report, the movement of TB-infected cattle poses the greatest threat to the disease security of uninfected farms, and particularly so in the case of farms in low disease risk areas. I won't make any, in a moment I will. Cattle movements are also likely to make a significant contribution to the local spread of infection in high-risk areas. That report goes on for page after page of different control strategies for low-risk areas, for high-risk areas, some of which were implemented by the last government and some of which are now being taken up by this government. A risk-based trading strategy has been started by this government, and we welcome that. There must be transparency in the marketplace to avoid farmers unknowingly importing infected cows into their herds. But the government has not investigated, for example, the 40% of farms in high-risk areas in the southwest that have consistently avoided bovine TB. What are they doing to protect their farms? How are they trading? What is their biosecurity? What are their husbandry practices? Can they be replicated? What can we learn? Until we get to the bottom of that, we are not going to find a solution. I give way to the Right Honourable Lady.
For giving way, as I think she's beginning to make clearer, this is a package. It's not either vaccine or culling. It is a fact the government's position is that it's a package of measures which were introduced, including security. But fundamentally at the heart of the vaccination question is the challenge of how to persuade 26 other member states of the European Union to import vaccinated cattle, the meat from cattle, when there are questions around the efficacy of the BCG vaccine and the efficacy of the skin test.
We now have the DIVA test, and we can now distinguish between vaccinated and infected cattle, and we know that the efficacy is at 65%, and those are figures that are in the EFRA Select Committee report today, 65% efficacy. Our priority must be to stop the spread of infected cattle into low-risk areas and spreading the disease. So to conclude, Mr. Speaker, the government is about to embark on a risky and untested cull. The cull will be bad for farmers, bad for taxpayers, and bad for wildlife. I give way.
Honourable friend for giving way. I think before she finishes, I think she made a very important point that even in areas of infection, there are farms that do manage to stay disease-free. And I think we need to learn the lessons of those. And there are other members on the House, other side of the House, have clearly made their mind up. All they want is a cull. They're not actually interested in the facts. They just want a cull.
With my honourable friend, there's nothing more dangerous than an idea if it's the only one you have. This so-called science-led cull has been disowned by the scientists who faced down those animal rights protesters to bring us the RBCT and a world-class scientific result. This cull will cost more than doing nothing. If it works at all, its effects will be marginal, and it carries real risks of making TB worse, both in cattle and in badgers. The original ISG group said, concentrating solely on the badger dimension in what is clearly a multidimensional and dynamic system of disease spread would be to fail to learn the lessons of previous experience. I won't give way, I'm finishing now. Any solution will need to work closely with farmers. Any solution will need to be technically, environmentally, socially and economically acceptable, and it will require the consent of taxpayers. Complex problems require complex solutions. This cull is not the solution.
order. The question is, as on the order paper, to move the amendment in the name of Her Majesty's Government. I call the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Mr. Owen Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister, myself and others. Mr. Speaker, this debate is about getting to grips with Mycobacterium bovis, a bacterium which can affect all mammals, including humans, a bacterium that has proved to be extremely resistant to all manner of attempts at eradication. It's a matter on which, over many years, there has been a great deal of agreement between the political parties. This was certainly the case in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, and during this period, the combination of political consensus and concerted action meant that we had this disease effectively beaten. In 1972, only 0.1% of cattle in this country tested as infected. And I very much regret that as this issue has become politicised, our grip on this disease has weakened, resulting in more than 60% of herds in high-risk areas such as Gloucestershire having been infected. The number of new cases is doubling every 10 years. What I can hope we can all agree on is that bovine TB is the most pressing animal health problem facing this country. The significance of the epidemic for our cattle farmers, their families and their communities cannot be overstated.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend. Looking at the statistics, in particular the spread now being almost unique, the increase in the United Kingdom, can he attribute anything to the fact that we are the only country, for very good reasons, to have given the badger protected status in the 1970s, that no other member state of the European Union does so, so its natural predator has actually not been able to control the increase in numbers and the potential spread of disease through the badger population?
Well, I'm grateful to the Chairman of the Select Committee for her question, and also I'd like to thank her for her report this morning. Where we are unique is that we are the only country that I know in the world with a significant problem of TB in cattle and a significant problem of TB in wildlife that does not bear down on the disease in wildlife. And there are arrangements, there's a clause, section 10(2)A, in the Protection of Badgers Act, which does allow the removal of diseased badgers, protection of preventing disease. So I would just like to point out, Mr. Speaker, this was once a disease isolated to small pockets in the country. It's now spread extensively through the west of England and Wales. Last year, TB led to the slaughter of more than 28,000 cattle in England at a cost to the taxpayer of nearly £100 million. In the last 10 years, bovine TB has seen 305,000 cattle slaughtered across Great Britain, costing the taxpayer £500 million. It's estimated that this will rise to £1 billion over the next decade if the disease is left unchecked. We cannot afford to let this happen. If we do not take tough and sometimes unpopular decisions, we'll be putting at risk the success story that is the UK cattle industry. The UK's beef and dairy exports have worked hard to develop markets valued at £1.7 billion in 2011. Our dairy exports alone grew by nearly 20% in 2011. We cannot afford to put such important and impressive industry performance at risk.
Can I lend the support of the NFU in North Yorkshire to his policy? They are desperate that this disease does not come north and come into Yorkshire, and they give it every support that they can.
Well, I'm very grateful to my friend's question. I know he's in very close touch with the farming community, and we do appreciate the real pressure they are under, and that's why we are determined to bring in measures which I'll elaborate in a moment, which will, we hope, reduce the disease in the high-risk areas, but also we must stop it going to the low-risk areas.
As well as the costs to the individual farmer and the taxpayer, which he has highlighted, would he also recognise that to have disease-free cattle is very important for the agri-food industry, which is actually a multi-billion pound industry for the whole of the United Kingdom, and especially for an economy like Northern Ireland?
Well, I'm very grateful for his question. He's absolutely right to mention the impact on the agri-food industry. which could be very seriously affected if we do not get a grip on this disease. He's absolutely right to highlight the risk, and that's why we are very determined to work on this policy and to learn from the neighbouring state, the Republic, and other states in the world who we got clear lessons, and I'll move on to that. The task of managing bovine TB and bringing it under control is difficult and complex, but that's absolutely no excuse for further inaction. And this government is committed to using all of the current tools at its disposal and continuing to develop new ones because we need a comprehensive package of measures to tackle the disease. International experience shows us very clearly that controlling wildlife species that harbour the disease and can pass it on to cattle must be part of that package. In recent...
Because I have written to him on this matter, because I asked what was the impact of a cull compared with the whole package that's been discussed, and he referred to New Zealand, and it said it was a result of rigorous biosecurity, strict cattle movement controls and proactive wildlife management that came along with the reduction in in TB. But I have asked for clarification what part was attributed to the cull, because the other two parts may well have contributed significantly, and I hope he will perhaps expand on that level of detail for those that are torn on this matter.
Well, I'm very grateful to my old friend for that question, because she asked the pertinent question. There is no single solution. So removing wildlife on its own is not the only solution. There has to be parallel and equally rigorous work on cattle. And that is the lesson which I was just about to explain from the countries that I've recently visited. She's absolutely right to raise this. It's not just cattle, it's not just wildlife, it's a mixture of both. And the examples I will give now show that that is the way to do it. So recently I've been to Australia, New Zealand and the Republic of Ireland, and when I was in opposition, I went to the United States of America. All of these countries have made great progress in dealing with very similar problems to ours by dealing with the wildlife reservoir and also bearing down on the disease in cattle. In Australia, there's been a national eradication programme spanning almost 3 decades. It enabled official freedom from bovine TB, an infection rate of less than 0.2% under OIE rules, to be achieved in 1997. And their comprehensive package of measures to tackle the disease in domestic cattle and wildlife included rigorous culling of feral water buffalo. Australia's achievement is even more impressive when one considers the difficulty of the terrain, the size of the area of which such an extensive programme of testing of cattle and culling of wildlife took place. In New Zealand, which my honourable friend mentioned, I was there following Australia. Their comprehensive and successful package of measures to eradicate the disease has focused on the primary wildlife reservoir of brush-tailed possums. As a result of their efforts, New Zealand is on the verge of achieving BTB-free status. And the number of infected cattle and deer herds has reduced from over 1,700 in the mid-1990s to just 66 in 2012. I recently went to the Republic of Ireland, which too has a comprehensive eradication programme which includes the targeted culling of badgers in areas where the disease is attributed to wildlife. From massive problems in the 1960s, 160,000 cattle were slaughtered in 1962 alone. The Irish authorities have turned things around to the extent that the number of reactor cattle has reduced now to just 18,000 in 2012, a reduction of 10,000 in the last 10 years. On their own figures, herd incidence has fallen to just 4.26%, a statistic we would dearly love to have here.
On that point, I'm very grateful in what is an excellent speech explaining the government's policy. Does he have any idea how many of, what percentage of the badgers culled in the Republic of Ireland actually were carriers themselves of TB? Because, of course, many of these badgers, who no one wants to see culled, obviously, unless we really have to, and if there's no alternative. But many of them, of course, are diseased and will in due course probably die and suffer great pain.
That's actually a very helpful question. On first analysis, the estimate was about 16%. But the Irish done a huge amount of work on this, and I really do admire the scientific manner in which they've gone about it. Actually, the number of those infected on real analysis after very, very careful autopsy can be 3 or 4 times higher than that. And that is why this disease is so difficult to get after. It is so difficult to identify, both in wildlife and in cattle. So
I'm grateful, and I'm listening carefully to the right honourable gentleman's speech. In section 4.5 of the Krebs report, there is an important section about the relationship between math and mathematical modelling, which is a hugely important tool that is not widely used within math as widely as it could be. What is he going to do about driving forward that part of the work that is clearly needed so we do get a better understanding of what is happening with or without a cull?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, which is the purpose, of course, of what we're doing is following on from the Krebs trials, the RBCT trials, and going on to the next logical step, which is to learn the lessons from them and to improve upon them. So the lessons were that 100 kilometres wasn't a big enough area, we're going to extend to nearly 300, to go for really clear, definitive geographical boundaries. And within that, I think the Honourable Member makes a really good point. We will be doing more analysis of the impact. I mean, these are 2 pilots. But the point I'm making, broadly, the broad lesson from these countries that I'm talking about, is that you have to bear down on disease in cattle in a very rigorous manner, as we are, and you also have to bear down on disease in wildlife. So when I was in opposition, I went to Michigan, and I saw the stringent cattle and wildlife controls there, which have seen significant progress made with a lowering of the prevalence of the disease in white-tailed deer in the endemic area by over 60% and breakdowns in livestock averaging just 3 or 4 a year from 2005 to 2011. And I can go on at great length, Mr. Speaker, but I know we're short of time. In Europe...
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He's giving a lot of international examples, but I'd like to know what lessons he is learning from the vaccination project in Wales, because to me that shows that there clearly is an alternative. I've read the results of the project very, very clearly. I'd like to know what lessons he's learned from that project.
Well, he raised a very important point, which could he just wait a few minutes? I will come to that point. Just to finish off the international comparisons, in Europe...
Keep going. Thank him for giving way. He talked again about what he's been around the world to look at all these, but the science we're looking at is the science in the UK, and clearly, even if you take those in favour of a cull, the actual progress that will be made is very, very small, even if you take that to actually be the fact, and you need a whole combination of measures. And culling, as some people on the other side of the House, will only make up, even if you believe in that, a very, very small, and it will not eradicate the actual disease.
Well, I am grateful to the because I don't think he quite listened to what I said. If he makes comparisons with the countries I've shown, where you have a very strict cattle controls, movement controls, biosecurity, and you bear down disease, you do reduce the disease. This experience of the Republic of Ireland is absolutely spectacular, and we should be humble enough to learn from it. If we look at other European countries, badger culling's undertaken in France, and there are current reports, just in the last week or so, of problems in the Ardennes with infected badgers being culled. Deer and wild boar are culled in Baltic countries, Germany, Poland and Spain. So we cannot ignore the lessons of these countries, which are so clearly presented to us. I'll take one more intervention. I do want to give other members a chance to get in.
Going on these European comparisons, why does his own amendment talk about stringent movement controls when we've actually got the largest movement controls in the European Union, with something like 40% of our cattle being moved annually? Surely he should start by doing something like that. Isn't that a comparison he should recognise?
I don't think that's a very accurate statement. We have very strict movement controls here, and our farmers find them difficult to adhere to. They do put real pressure on farms. But if we do tackle bovine TB, we must not only maintain rigorous biosecurity and strict cattle movement controls, but also bear down on disease in wildlife. So it's for this reason, okay, this really is the last intervention for a bit, okay?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He will recollect that the RBCT not just studied the effects of culling on the badger population and the prevalence of TB, but also the actions of Homo sapiens as well, and their capacity to intervene and to disrupt trials. And that was a factor within this particular trial. I mean, this is a factor which is particularly prevalent within the UK, which isn't prevalent in many of the countries that he's named already.
Well, I'm grateful, my friend, for that question. Mr. Speaker, I know you're an assiduous reader of Hansard, and you probably remember every one of my 600 parliamentary questions on this issue, one of which revealed, as my honourable said, that 56% of the traps were tampered with during the Krebs trials, and 14% were actually stolen. So, of course, that is one of the lessons we are learning from the Krebs trials, that there might be a more efficient and humane manner of removing badgers. So, anyone who has looked closely at this will see a comprehensive cattle testing programme, combined with the restrictions on cattle movements, remain the foundation of our policy. Those restrictions have been further strengthened over the last year to reduce the chance of disease spreading from cattle. In January, we introduced a new surveillance testing regime and stricter cattle movement controls, which means that we'll be testing more cattle annually and working hard to get in front of the disease to protect those parts of the country where bovine TB is not a major problem. We will continue to maintain the significant effort that we put into enhancing cattle controls and combating cattle-to-cattle transmission. Honourable Lady, I really do appreciate other people to get in. Can I just push on just a bit further? Vaccination is another tool that we will continue to invest in. We are spending £15.5 million on research and development in this Parliament, one that I know many members would like to see deployed. And £43 million has been invested in this vital work since 1994, as was alluded to by the Shadow Secretary. We too would like to deploy it more widely. But I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, we're just not there yet in terms of either development or practicality, as been very clearly described in this morning's EFRA Select Committee highlights. So oral cattle and badger vaccines will, I hope, prove viable, but they will not be ready to deploy for years. And we can't wait while the disease puts more livestock farms out of business and threatens the sustainability of the industry. In January this year, the Minister of State and I met the EU Commissioner for Health and Consumer Policy, Tony O'Borge, here to discuss our progress towards a cattle vaccine. And while he acknowledged that we've done more than any other country to take this work forward, he confirmed that the implementation of a legal and validated cattle vaccine is still at least 10 years away. I will generously give way to the Shadow Minister.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Could I ask him just to clarify the comments he made a moment ago, that if there was a viable badger vaccination, whether it's oral or injectable, that was developed within the next few years, is it his position that there would be no intention from him to then proceed with any cull? It would be his preference to move forward with vaccination of badgers instead?
Well, that's a question I was going to come on to, Mr. Speaker, but I'll touch on now. I think there is very clearly a really valuable role for an effective badger vaccine once the disease is under control. And I discussed it at some length in the Republic, where they have now pretty well got diseases well on the way down. Once you can get it to those really low levels, emphatically, and this answers his honourable friend's question, there is definitely a role. There's no question of this. There is a role for badger vaccine, but it's got to work. And the worry I have, and I'll jump ahead a bit on Wales, is that at the moment there is nothing to be gained by vaccinating a diseased animal. And that animal can continue to be a super excretor and continue to spread disease. And that is the problem I have with the Welsh experiment. We're very interested in it, and we'll watch it carefully. But from my travels, and I was particularly struck by the Irish experience, the lesson, and they've done a lot of work on this themselves, the lesson is you have to get that disease down to a certain level to get healthy badgers, and then you protect them. And the real lesson in Ireland, because we all want to see healthy badgers living alongside healthy cattle, the average badger in Ireland, Mr. Speaker, is now 1 kilo heavier than before they began the cull. So they've achieved where we want to go. They are getting a healthy badger population, which is exactly what we want. But that's the point when I think you can deploy vaccination. So I'm not entirely convinced the Welsh Government's on the right track. I think they're going in too early because they've not got a grip on the disease. But we wish them well. So, on that, it is sadly incredibly expensive. The cost of vaccination in Wales currently stands at £662 per badger, or £3,900 per square kilometre per year. So even if the practical difficulties could be addressed, we know that a large-scale programme of badger vaccination would take longer to achieve disease control benefits compared to a programme of culling on a similar scale. Sorry, there's... Andrew.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Can I draw his attention to one area of healthy badgers, just to draw on his point about vaccination, relating to Cheshire, which is on the frontier of the disease spreading north. I'm working closely with the Cheshire Wildlife Trust and the National Farmers Union to see whether there's the possibility of a vaccinated band of badgers across Cheshire to prevent that northern spread. Will he work with those two organisations and me to see what is practical to achieve?
Well, I'm very glad old friend that question, because it's a very useful one. I know he's already talking to my old friend, the Minister of State. And it is certainly worth looking at that, creating rings. But the lesson, I think, from these other countries, you've really got to get the disease reservoir down first, and then you can create this band. The problem is, when you've got the level of disease we're talking about, you can't gain an advantage by vaccinating a diseased animal which is already a super excretor, and it can go on excreting disease in huge volume. And another of my questions, Mr. Speaker, was 1 millilitre of badger urine produces 300,000 colony-forming units of disease, and it takes very, very few, a single number of those, to infect a cattle by aspiration. You won't have that effect. So I think what he's talking about is very well worth looking at. But I just think in parallel to that, we've got to get the disease down. So, I do apologise. So, the full programme allows... the Honourable Lady's tried hard.
The Secretary of State for so generously giving way. And does he recall comparing the search for a TB vaccine by scientists to Sisyphus, or I think Tantalus, as he later clarified, in that it was always out of reach? And does he understand how insulting many scientists found that comparison, and also how it undermines his scientific credibility? If he doesn't understand how science works, how can we trust his analysis of the evidence?
Honestly, I think the Honourable Lady is being a little hard. We have given credit. No, honestly, I do think that is a little hard. We've given credit to the last government, which he supported, for the significant investment in vaccines, and we'll have continued that significant investment. We had Commissioner Borge over. We had an incredibly constructive discussion, but it is, I think Sisyphus was trying to shove the rock uphill and Tantalus is reaching in the pool. And it is incredibly frustrating for us all that it's still 10 years away. And also, I mean, getting back on the badger vaccine, this is a very important point to my old friend just now. The early trials, there's been some small trials on calves in Ethiopia, showed that it's actually only 56 to 68% effective. So there's a lot of work to be done to get, first of all, a vaccine that really works, and then a vaccine which can be identified, because picking up the Honourable Member from Milanshi's comment, you cannot have international trade under OIE rules if you cannot identify a diseased animal and a vaccinated animal. So honestly, the last thing I'm doing, casting aspersions on any scientist working on this. We all have a massive interest in arriving there, but every time we look, it's at least 10 years away. And I think, honestly, the timetable that Commissioner Borge has set us, we'll do well if we stick to it at 10 years. So, I'm going to push on. So, that is another reason why we plan to consult on a new draft TB eradication strategy for England over the coming months, which we touch on in the amendment, which will set out in some detail how we plan to reach our long-term goal of achieving officially bovine TB-free status for England. That will involve better diagnostic tests such as PCR and targeted controls to bear down on the disease where it's at its worst, stop the spread across new areas and protect the relative disease freedom that large parts of the country already enjoy. All those who take this problem seriously now accept that the research in this country over the past 15 years has demonstrated that cattle and badgers transmit the disease to each other. There are few now who choose to argue that culling badgers, done carefully and correctly, cannot lead to a reduction of the disease in cattle. In 1997, the noble Lord, Lord Krebs, and the Independent Scientific Review Group concluded that, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, the sum of evidence strongly supports the view that in Britain badgers are a significant source of infection in cattle. Most of this evidence is indirect, consisting of correlations rather than demonstrations of cause and effect, but in total, the available evidence, including the effects of completely removing badgers from certain areas, is compelling. Since then, ongoing analysis of the results of the randomised badger culling trial has shown beyond reasonable doubt the important role that culling can play in checking the progress of bovine TB, in spite of any initial disruption to badger population on the edge of the culled area. Professor Crystal Donnelly, a former member of the ISG, wrote, "In the time period from 1 year after the last proactive cull To the 28th of August 2011, the incidence of confirmed breakdowns in the proactive culling trial areas was 28% lower than in survey-only areas, and on lands up to 2 kilometres outside proactive trial areas was 4.1% lower than outside survey-only areas. I firmly believe that based on the best available evidence, culling badgers to control TB can make a significant contribution to getting on top of this terrible disease. I have no doubt that the benefits from badger control will, to the businesses, farmers and communities that have suffered for too long, prove worthwhile, and that's why it is crucial that these pilots go ahead. The National Farmers Union has taken the lead on behalf of the farming industry and has planned and organised the pilot culls. They've been working tirelessly over the last few months to make them a success, ensuring all involved carry out their functions to a very high professional standard and in ways which will take full account of the need to protect public safety. I've been immensely impressed by the effort, commitment and determination that have been demonstrated by farmers in the 2 pilot areas, despite the unacceptable intimidation and hostility that some have endured. The professionalism of the police with whom we continue to work also deserves praise. It's possible that some additional policing will be needed to enable peaceful protests during the pilots, and this may add to the cost of the pilots. I hope it's not necessary for the police to deal with people who are intent on unlawful and threatening behaviour to law-abiding and hard-working people. Such obstructive action cannot be allowed to prevent us from tackling this disease. Opponents of this policy will say that it's possible to rid the country of bovine TB without tackling the problem in wildlife. There is no evidence for this in any other country where there is or has been a significant reservoir of the disease in species of wildlife in comparison to cattle, as is unfortunately the case here. And my experience in Australia, Michigan, New Zealand, the Republic of Ireland have absolutely reinforced this essential point. You may also be told that we'll fail because we don't have enough reliable estimates of badger numbers in the pilot areas. On the contrary, we've invested considerable time and effort in monitoring work to establish a reliable estimate of the number of badgers in the areas. These figures were used by Natural England as part of the licensing process to set the minimum and maximum number of badgers to be culled. You may also hear from some quarters that we're putting the badger population in those areas at risk of extinction. That too is untrue, as confirmed in the opinion of the Berne Convention. The 2 pilots will see the removal of a little around 5,000 badgers, a minimum of 2,081 in West Somerset and 2,856 in West Gloucestershire. That's around 10% of the 50,000 badgers killed on our roads each year, or just over 1% of the estimated national population. The number of badgers actually culled and the culling method used in each case will be recorded by the operators and be part of the licence returns to Natural England. During the pilots, there will also be independent monitoring of the effectiveness, humaneness and safety of badger control. So, I hope it's evident why the government is committed to this policy. It is just one element of a comprehensive approach to the eradication of bovine TB, as our amendment to the motion makes clear. But it is an essential element, and one that can help us to start to win the war against a bacterium that has proved so damaging and resilient to other interventions. We will not shy, Mr Deputy Speaker, from tough decisions which we believe to be fully evidence-based and fundamentally the right thing to do. We will continue to work with all those who wish to see healthy cattle living alongside healthy badgers. I therefore hope that members opposite will reconsider their position and support our amendment, which sets out the broad, balanced and evidence-based approach we are taking to tackle this horrible disease.